You're standing in your front yard, watching a bank representative stride confidently toward your new home's front door, ready to force you to accept shoddy construction work that could literally kill your family. He grabs a doorknob with authority, pulls, and the entire door frame and all crashes down on top of him. That's just the beginning of one of the most satisfying legal revenge stories you'll ever hear. If you've ever felt powerless against big institutions trying to bully you into accepting less than you deserve, you're going to love this story. Hit that like button. Subscribe for more incredible tales of justice served cold, and buckle up, because what this small-town attorney pulled off was absolutely legendary. It was 1973, and after years of saving every penny, my parents finally had enough money to build their dream home, a modest little ranch house in the countryside where they could raise their 2 young children. They weren't asking for a mansion, just a safe, well-built home where they could create memories and build a future. The local bank, one of those small-town institutions where everyone knew everyone, approved their mortgage application. The paperwork was signed, hands were shaken, and my parents felt that incredible rush of excitement that comes with taking such a huge step forward in life. They had found their contractor, a man I'll call Bob, who came highly recommended and promised to deliver their dream home on time and on budget. But Bob, as it turned out, was running a construction empire built on quicksand. You see, Bob had been taking on project after project all over town, spreading himself so thin that he was basically just a ghost who occasionally showed up to collect checks. The actual work, that was left to what my dad would later describe as the most incompetent crew of workers ever assembled in the history of construction. What started as a 6-month build stretched into 8 months, then 10, then a full year. But it wasn't just the delays that were driving my parents to the brink of insanity. It was the quality of work that would have made a first-year trade school student weep with embarrassment. Picture this. The architect had left a stray line on the blueprints. Just a simple drafting error that should have been caught by anyone with half a brain. But Bob's framers? They built a wall right through where the bathtub was supposed to go. Not near it, not around it, through it. My mother stood in what was supposed to be her bathroom, staring at a wall that made the space completely unusable, while Bob's foreman shrugged and said, "Well, that's what the plan showed." But wait, it gets worse. The kitchen cabinets, those things that are supposed to hold dishes, food, and all the essentials of daily life, were attached to nothing but drywall using roofing nails. Not screwed into studs like any competent carpenter would do, but literally just nailed to the back of the cabinet into drywall. When my mother asked about it, she was told with a straight face, "Don't put anything heavy in there." What exactly was she supposed to store in kitchen cabinets, if not kitchen items? And then there was the garage door, the opening that was supposed to face the driveway, allowing cars to actually enter the garage, was instead framed to open into the living room, because apparently Bob's crew thought my parents wanted to park their car next to the couch. While this construction nightmare was unfolding, my parents were living in what my mother described as a nasty rental, a cramped, run-down place that was supposed to be temporary, but was becoming their prison. 2 tiny children, barely enough space to breathe, and the constant stress of watching their life savings disappear into what was becoming the house from hell. My father was working 2 jobs, leaving before dawn and coming home after dark, just to keep up with the mounting costs and delays. My mother, a stay-at-home mom trying to manage 2 young children in impossible conditions, spent her days fielding calls from Bob's crew asking questions that proved they had no idea what they were doing, and her nights crying from the stress and frustration. This should have been the most exciting time in their lives. Instead, it became a daily nightmare of broken promises, incompetent work, and the growing realization that their dream was turning into a financial and emotional catastrophe. But the worst part wasn't the shoddy construction. It was how they were being treated by the very people who were supposed to be helping them achieve their dream. The bank representatives spoke to them like they were ungrateful children, who didn't understand how construction worked. Bob treated them like they were unreasonable perfectionists who expected too much. When my mother called to complain about obvious problems, she was dismissed, patronized, and made to feel like she was a problem. My father, exhausted from working 2 jobs and dealing with this mess, began to sink into a depression that worried my mother more than all the construction problems combined. This was supposed to be their fresh start, their piece of the American dream. Instead, it was destroying their family from the inside out. After months of this torture, the bank finally sent a representative for what they called a final inspection. My parents, who had been documenting every single problem, every safety hazard, every code violation, met in the front yard with a thick folder of evidence and a firm resolve. They would not sign off on this death trap. The bank representative, clearly annoyed that these difficult customers were holding up his paperwork, became increasingly aggressive. He had paid Bob a substantial amount of money, and he wanted this deal closed. Now, this is ridiculous, he snapped, striding toward the front door. The house is fine. You people are just being unreasonable. He grabbed the front door handle with the confidence of a man who was used to get his way, pulled hard to make his point about the house being perfectly acceptable, and crash. The entire door, handle, frame, casing, everything came off in his hands and crashed down on top of him because Bob's crew hadn't actually installed it. They had just wedged it into place and hoped for the best. As the bank representative lay there, covered in door parts and looking like he'd been hit by a cartoon anvil, my parents realized they had reached a point of no return. What happened next was exactly what you'd expect from people who've been caught red-handed but refused to take responsibility. The bank, embarrassed and angry about the money they'd already paid Bob, decided the problem wasn't incompetent construction. It was my parents' unreasonable expectations. They threatened foreclosure, claiming my parents were in breach of contract for refusing to accept the completed work. Bob, meanwhile, was facing his own crisis. The bank was refusing to pay him the remaining balance until my parents signed off, but he had already spent money he didn't have on other projects. His solution? Threatened to sue my parents for breach of contract, claiming they were preventing him from completing his obligations. So there were my parents, living in a terrible rental, watching their dream home fall apart before their eyes, being threatened with foreclosure by the bank and a lawsuit by the contractor, all while trying to raise 2 small children and keep their sanity intact. They had 3 choices: sign off on a house that could literally kill them, lose everything in a legal battle they couldn't afford, or find some miracle solution that seemed impossible. That's when they decided to visit an attorney. The attorney, let's call him Tom, was exactly what you'd expect from a small-town lawyer in 1973. Kind, patient, and experienced in dealing with the everyday legal problems of ordinary people. But he was also sharp, and he had seen enough construction disputes to know that this case was going to be complicated. My parents sat in his modest office, spreading out their documentation like refugees displaying their most precious possessions. Photos of the wall through the bathtub, receipts showing the mounting costs, letters from the bank making increasingly aggressive demands. Tom listened patiently, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. But my father could see in his face the slight frown, the way he rubbed his temples, the occasional shake of his head. This was bad, really bad. We don't have much money left, my mother said quietly. If this becomes a long court battle, we'll lose everything. Tom nodded sympathetically. He had seen this story before. Ordinary people getting crushed between big institutions and unscrupulous contractors. The bank had money for lawyers. Bob had money for lawyers. My parents had their life savings tied up in a house that was uninhabitable. But then something changed. Tom had been flipping through the paperwork, probably looking for some small technicality he could use to negotiate a better settlement, when he suddenly stopped. His eyebrows shot up. He looked at one document, then another, then back to the first. And then, for the first time since my parents had walked into his office, Tom smiled. Not a polite, professional smile. A genuine, ear-to-ear grin that lit up his entire face. "Let's get everyone together for a meeting," he told my parents, his voice suddenly filled with confidence. Tomorrow, the next day, they all gathered at the bank like gunslingers meeting for a final duel. My parents, nervous but hopeful. Tom, carrying a briefcase and wearing the expression of a man who held all the cards. The bank's representative, still probably sore from his encounter with the door. The bank's attorney, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Bob, sweating and fidgeting. And Bob's attorney, who clearly had no idea what he was walking into. The bank's representative started to speak, probably planning to launch into another lecture about unreasonable expectations and contractual obligations. Tom had let him get a word out. "Well," Tom said, his voice carrying the theatrical flair of a man who had been waiting his entire career for this moment, "my clients have decided that they no longer want this house. Please remove it." The silence that followed was the kind you hear right before an explosion. Then the laughter started. Nervous chuckles from the bank's attorney. A snort of disbelief from Bob. Full-blown laughter from the bank representative. "Remove it?" The bank's attorney managed between laughs. "Have you lost your mind? You can't just remove a house." Tom waited for the laughter to die down. Then, with the timing of a master showman, he reached into his briefcase and placed a single document on the table. "A deed. My client owned the land the house is sitting on outright," Tom said, his voice now deadly serious. "They no longer want the house. Get the house off my client's land." The laughter stopped like someone had flipped a switch. Bob's attorney picked up the deed, studied it, then slowly turned to look at Bob with the expression of a man watching his client's life implode in real time. "You built a house on land you don't own?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Bob nodded miserably. The bank's attorney, meanwhile, had gone pale as he realized the implications. He turned to the bank's representative with fury building in his voice. "You didn't finance the land the house is on?" The representative stammered. No." Tom leaned back in his chair, savoring the moment like a fine wine. "As I said, gentlemen, you're trespassing on my client's land. I expect the house to be removed and the land returned to its original state. At once." My father would later say that the looks on their faces were burned into his memory forever. You could practically see the gears turning in their heads as they realized the full scope of their predicament. The bank could foreclose on a house that wouldn't exist by the end of the week. They had no way to recoup their money because they didn't even own the land it was sitting on. Bob was out the 50% he had paid out of his own pocket. Plus, he was now on the hook for the cost of tearing down the house and hauling it away. And on top of that, the bank would undoubtedly want him to repay the initial 50% they had given him. Could they have gone after my parents legally? Sure. A foreclosure would have meant bad credit. They might have lost their down payment. But signing off on the house in its current condition would have meant thousands and thousands of dollars in repairs just to make it safe to live in. Money the bank knew my parents didn't have because they're the ones who had approved a mortgage in the first place. The beautiful irony was perfect. The bank and Bob had been so focused on cutting corners and bullying my parents into accepting substandard work that they had overlooked the most basic element of the entire transaction. What happened next was like watching a magic trick in reverse. Suddenly, my parents weren't difficult customers with unreasonable expectations. They were valued clients who had been the victims of a terrible misunderstanding. The bank representative, who had been condescending and aggressive just minutes before, was now apologetic and eager to help. Bob, who had been threatening lawsuits and dismissing their concerns, was suddenly very interested in making things right. The house was brought up to the original specifications immediately, at no extra cost to my parents but at considerable expense to Bob. Every wall was properly framed. Every cabinet was securely attached to studs. The garage door was moved to face the actual driveway. The plumbing worked. The electrical was up to code. My parents signed the mortgage. Bob got the rest of his money, and just about broke even on the entire project. The bank's representative was quietly fired. And Tom? Tom got the kind of story that attorneys tell each other for the rest of their careers. The perfect case where preparation, attention to detail, and a little bit of luck combine to deliver absolute justice. Sometimes the system works exactly the way it's supposed to. Sometimes the little guy wins not through luck or sympathy, but through the simple application of the law by someone smart enough to see what everyone else missed. My parents got their dream home. Bob learned a very expensive lesson about proper business practices. And the bank learned that cutting corners and bullying customers can backfire in spectacular fashion. If this story gave you chills and made you believe in justice again, smash that like button and tell us in the comments. What's the most satisfying legal victory you've ever witnessed? Have you ever seen someone get their comeuppance in such perfect fashion? And of course, subscribe for more incredible stories of underdogs who refused to back down and found a way to win against all odds.